Hello, my name is Cheyenne Hunter, and I'm here to talk to you about gentrification and the long lasting negative effects it has on society and how the wealth gap and racial segregation help aid in deprived areas. So, economically deprived areas are typically areas that are not so nice. They lack good resources, they lack infrastructure, and most of all, they lack a healthy income to provide tax dollars to keep up the area. One of the best examples that I could use would be Southeast DC. Southeast DC is an economically deprived area. You could tell just by the treatment of the area. For example, you'll see a lot more trash on the ground within neighborhoods versus the Petworth area of DC, which is a predominantly white area. They keep it pretty clean in Petworth versus DC, which is a low income minority area. They don't keep it as beautified as they would a higher income area. They also experience more vandalism and building vandalism, specifically within Southeast DC. So you'll see a lot more spray paint on things, a lot more broken goods within that area. Typically, economically deprived areas are categorized as ghettos or hoods. But that is just a glimpse of what an economically deprived area is. Most times, economically deprived areas are full of low income minority individuals who live check to check. They're typically single mothers or single fathers. That just they have no true career. They're just working individuals. And all of this leads from the wealth gap and racial segregation when America was initially founded. So when America was initially founded, the founding fathers made policies that only benefited white Americans. It only benefited the people who were deemed superior to minorities, aka black people, and other people of color like Native Americans and Hispanics. They were deemed inferior to white people. So even until today, within policy, you still see some laws and rules and accommodations that only positively affect white people. They don't affect black people positively. So specifically speaking on segregation, so my example I used was Petworth versus Southeast DC. Southeast DC is on the other side of the Anacostia watershed. So pretty much it's divided not only by water, but it's divided by a bridge. So Southeast DC doesn't have easy access to the nicer area of town. You almost have to go out of your way to get up to the nicer area of town where things are kept up. The infrastructures are nice. So racial segregation within living spaces is common. Typically, you would see with the concentric circular model, you would see that within zone 1 they're going to be downtown, then outside of zone 1, zone 2, you'll see apartment living, and then you will go into middle class, and then you will go to upper class, which is in the suburban areas. More suburban sprawl is happening now, and people are actually moving back into the city. More suburban people are moving back into the city, forcing lower income people out of the city into more impoverished areas that lack infrastructure and lack beautification. So the biggest thing with the racial segregation is how the city grid is set up. You will most likely see blacks on one side of the city. For example, Southeast is on one side of the watershed, and most of the predominantly white areas with higher infrastructure is on the other side of the watershed. This racial segregation also stems from the wealth gap. So again, when the founding fathers created our country, they created it to benefit white individuals more so than black individuals. So now we have more educated white people, because 100 years ago they weren't allowing black people to read or go to school or learn reading, writing, and arithmetics. So there's not only an educational gap, but the educational gap leads into a wealth gap because we are not as skilled as your average white person. So your average white person could easily make $20,000 or $30,000 more a year than a low income minority who is only making, $40,000 or $50,000 a year. So the wealth gap in between whites and black minorities are one of the major things that fuels and powers gentrification. So within my paper, I spoke on how people who are in low income areas, low income renters, low income homeowners, typically they're more so worried about making their ends meet. Getting to the next payday, making sure that their lights are going to be on for the next 30 days. They're not worried about, missing shingles on the roof, or, there's a hole in the wall on the inside of my house. Those, small beautification things that would be very important to a homeowner that can afford, fixing things, is not important to someone who's impoverished, to someone who's barely being able to pay their rent. So when it comes to the wealth gap, there's a difference between being able to live sustainably and being able to, if there's a mistake that happens, like your water heater breaks or something, they're able to fix it, versus a minority that is experiencing the worst end of the wealth gap. They're not going to be worried about, replacing a water heater, and they don't even have lights to heat the water heater. So that is one of those big things. But the government looks at the deprived areas and the lack of infrastructure in areas as a bad thing. Because some homeowners, they end up moving out. They just can't, bear the cost of being a homeowner. So now you have vandalized properties. Now you have graffiti everywhere. Now you have some properties that are half ran down, some properties that are not even being ran at all. And when you have a lot of vandalism, when you have a lot of, vacant areas, it festers crime. So that brings in another, piece of the puzzle, because now crime in impoverished areas is at an all-time high, because it's easier to resort to crime when, your odds are not that bad. If I don't steal the soap, I won't be able to take my children a bath. But if I go to the store and ask for money, people are going to look at me crazy. So it's a fine line in between being impoverished and not having the resources needed to get what you need. So within all of this, the wealth gap and the racial gap, we've learned that gentrification is aided by the wealth gap and racial segregation. The government is like, okay, let's go in and invest into these properties, send contractors into these properties to buy them out, fix them up, and make them look good. But that doesn't actually fix the issue that there's a wealth and racial segregation going on and a wealth gap going on. So they're displacing these individuals that are deemed incompetent to take care of a property. They're just moving them to other ghettos. They're just, because the rent is going up in these areas that they previously lived in, and they can't afford it anymore. So now they're on to the next impoverished area with the affordable rent, because there's a wealth gap. They can't afford nice housing. They can't even afford to fix things in the house that they had. So now they're in another situation where it's festering more crime, it's festering more in poverty, and it's festering a lot of mental health issues, because when gentrification is deemed as fixing an underdeveloped issue, an underdeveloped community, it actually doesn't. It just, sweeps the people under the rug, aka displaces them to another society, to another neighborhood, until the government goes to the neighborhood they displaced them to and says, okay, we don't want this to look like this anymore. Let's get some upper class and middle class people here to get tax dollars here so it can look better. So in solutions, the racial segregation and the wealth gap has to be corrected before gentrification as a whole can be corrected, because currently gentrification is just playing hot potato across the city with where the impoverished area is going to be. Because although a white person with money moved into this area, that black person that didn't have money still has to have somewhere to live. So it doesn't fix the fact that they still don't have the resources to live a suitable life. And pretty much that's what my paper was about, gentrification, and how wealth and racial segregation festers gentrification.